wanted to start off a little bit with the punchline and then work back from that. So just go through some of the recent media headlines we've received about the economy. Headlines that have been expressed in that usual fashion of panic and alarm from newspapers in great big bold letters. So in Canada recently we got the story that our output, our gross domestic product, fell in February, and people are gnashing their hands and their teeth saying that growth in the first quarter will only be something like 1.7% or 2%. A month ago, we saw very similar headlines in the United States with alarm that the United States only grew 2.2% in the first quarter, and isn't that terrible? That means they're not even beginning to recover from the deep recession. And we've got similar headlines in Europe, but the numbers, of course, worse. One of the recent ones being that Spain has had 2 negative output outcomes, and hence it's in a technical recession. And the fourth headline we've seen, again expressed with surprise to us, is that the emerging economies have accounted for 2/3 of the growth in the world economy since the end of the recession in 2009. And I read those with surprise that the media in turn, or analysts, are surprised, because I think those are pretty much what we would expect, and we should expect more of that. And maybe they're alarming, maybe they're disturbing, but they shouldn't be surprising. So I want to step back and a little bit unravel that story of why I think that those numbers shouldn't surprise us and why we should expect a bit more of that. So I want to start off with the last one, the emerging economies forming 2/3 of the world economic growth, and why that in particular should be expected to be a fairly normal outcome. So 2009, being a pretty deep recession, was relatively remarkable for a lot of different things, but the one that I like from the perspective of enjoying symmetry is we neatly divided the world economy in two. So the so-called poor emerging economies accounted for 50% of all the output in the world, and the developed, wealthier economies accounted for the other 50%. We only have to go back to 1980, and the emerging economies were only 1/3 of the world economy. So in a mere 29 years, they went from 1/3 to 1/2, and of course the flip side of that symmetry is the wealthy, developed economies went from 2/3 to 1/2. In my crystal ball, when I try to extrapolate the growth rates I would expect country by country around the world, I get the completion of that symmetry turn by 2026. In other words, the emerging economies will become 2/3 of the world economy, and the developed, wealthy economies will become 1/3. So if we put the two bookends together, and we're only talking about a 46-year time period from 1980 to 2026, the emerging economies will go from 1/3 to 2/3, and the developed, wealthy economies from 2/3 to 1/3. So observing something like the emerging economies, the Chinas and the Indias and the Brazils and the like around the world have accounted for 2/3 growth since the end of the recovery, means that they're pulling a little bit above their weight because they're now just slightly above 0.5%, but it's not that unusual. And certainly as we approach the next decade and the next 15 years, that would become the norm. So I'm thinking that people who are surprised by some of that result have really paid attention to how the world economy is shifting. In the last 40 years, the average growth rate of the world economy has just been slightly below 4% after inflation terms. And lo and behold, last year and this year, we're going to be around a similar growth rate to that. But that is basically the emerging economies growing in the 4 to 5% growth rate collectively, and the developed, wealthier economies growing in the 1 to 2% rate. It's a little bit even exaggerated right now because particularly the European and Japanese developed economies are not even growing at what you would think is their sustainable rate. But again, it's not all that unusual. So there's one second comment on the world economic events. One thing I think we should just put back into our memories as record was another very pronounced effect from the recession in 2008 and 2009. It was the first time, and since we've had the data in the world economy since the Second World War, that the world economy went into recession. You'll all remember we had very deep recessions here in the United States, Japan, and Europe in the early 1980s and the early 1990s, but we did not have output decline across the total world. Same thing in the 1990s, and the reason is the developed economies were going down, the emerging economies were still growing, and we had the flip side of that in the late 1990s, where we had the emerging economies get hit very hard by the so-called Asian crises, but the developed economies didn't get hit that hard. So in other words, we did not have a synchronization of economic cycles around the world. And this was quite different in 2008 and 2009. We had individual countries getting hit quite hard, but we saw a synchronization of that cycle. Yes, China did not go into a recession the way we would think of a recession as negative output, but they did come down from 11 or 12% growth rate to 6 to 7%. So the weakening of the developed economies definitely did hit them. And I think it's interesting from an investment perspective to pose the question, was that a one-off unusual event, or is that a new economic order? And I think for 4 reasons it is part of the new economic order. The first is that trade since the Second World War has been growing at double the pace around the world as output. So everybody is becoming more specialized in producing and exporting what they do really well, and if they don't do it particularly well, they import it. So we have a lot of trade linkages that we never had before. And of course, if economy weakens, let's say if the United States, as it weakens, it purchases less, and that means its imports weaken, but the United States imports are China's exports, so it immediately exports their weakness to some other country. Secondly, we've seen the globalization of financial linkages. The best example of that was in the U.S. subprime mortgage debt. That you would think it was an American problem, and for the most part that should have remained within American borders, but they syndicated the debt, and the syndicated debt was purchased by agents all around the world. And 2 of the initial high-profile failures that were caused by the U.S. subprime mortgage were in fact a long way away from the United States. It was an Australian hedge fund and a community in Norway who had put their surplus funds into those debt products. And you saw almost instantaneously a problem in one country through the financial linkages appearing somewhere else. The third reason is monetary policy. Milton Friedman, probably one of the most famous economists we've ever had, used to say that economic cycles are a product of monetary policy. And we have to note in that context that 90% of the world's output comes from economies that have a formal or informal inflation targeting regime. So some of them are like Canada, they have an explicit number. Some of them in the United States, they've never enunciated an explicit number, but we know from their actions they do have one in their mind. And so all the monetary authorities around the world, and this has been in place now for the last 10 or 20 years, are always doing the same thing at the same time. They're lowering interest rates simultaneously, they're raising interest rates simultaneously, and that, of course, has given us a synchronization of the economic cycle. The fourth factor is fiscal policy. We had never witnessed a synchronization of fiscal policy around the world until 2009. And one of the early meetings of the G20, when the head of the IMF, who you and I had probably never heard about since then, but we've known an awful lot about him. He's so famous now, he's just known by his initials, DSK. Unfortunately, he became famous for a lot of things unconnected to running the IMF and largely extracurricular activities on his part, but he is a very famous person right now, and he was handed a microphone and he said, what should all the countries do about this? And he said they should massively fiscally stimulate their economies, somewhere in the cent of 2 to 4% of their gross domestic product, and lo and behold, everybody did that. And so again, you had not only the synchronization of monetary policy, but you had everybody conducting the same fiscal policy. Fast forward to April 2009, he's long gone from the IMF, facing other court battles in other cities, and he's got a new head of the IMF. A microphone gets stuck in front of her face, and she said, what should everybody do? She said everybody should massively switch to fiscal restraint, and lo and behold, everybody did. They just turned on a dime, but not just some countries, everybody did that simultaneously. And so you're going to see similar outcomes.